a tuxedo, a spotlight, a secret. They were Britain's most beloved actors, knighted, worshipped, untouchable. But behind the charm, behind the curtain, lived a different story. One never printed in the papers, only whispered in the wings. This isn't about scandal. It's about survival, silence, and the coded lives of men who shaped British cinema, while hiding from the very world that applauded them. 17 legends, 17 shadows, and not one of them ever said it out loud. Until now. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe. It helps us keep telling the stories that history left in the margins. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We see you, night owls. 1. Sir Ian McKellen. It always starts with a stage. Before he was Magneto or Gandalf, Sir Ian McKellen was just another northern boy with Shakespeare on his lips and something heavier on his chest. He came from a world that wasn't ready to hear what he had to say, not just in words, but in love. Born in 1939, Ian's early life was an exercise in coded silences, in applause that never quite reached his own reflection. And yet somehow, through all the ash-gray repression of post-war England, McKellen emerged in full color, dazzling, defiant, and eventually, unapologetically gay. He came out publicly in 1988, live on BBC Radio during a debate over Section 28, a piece of legislation that banned the promotion of homosexuality in schools. He didn't do it for applause. He did it because someone had to. In a way, it was the ultimate performance, unscripted, irreversible, and real. But here's the twist. By that point, McKellen had already conquered British theater. Audiences knew him, respected him, revered him. So when he came out, it wasn't a career death sentence. It was a cultural recalibration. And still, the timing is curious. He waited until the late 80s, decades into a dazzling career of Lear, Macbeth, and Marlowe, to say it out loud. Why? Because for all the standing ovations, Britain didn't stand for that. Even in the rarefied air of the Royal Shakespeare Company, love between men was something best left behind the curtain. But McKellen was never content behind anything. And in breaking the silence, he didn't just free himself, he gave others permission to speak. His bravery, though lauded now, was once whispered about in hushed green rooms and coded glances. It wasn't safe, it wasn't guaranteed, and it certainly wasn't fashionable. He didn't just act on stage, he acted on principle. And just when you think you've seen the boldest performance of his life, watch what happens when we go back in time to a night in 1953, when another knight of the realm walked out of a public lavatory into the cold, metallic grip of post-war morality. 2. Sir John Gielgud. The police report was clear, persisting and importuning. In other words, Sir John Gielgud, Shakespearean titan, knight of the realm, had been caught soliciting a man in a Chelsea public toilet. It was 1953, a year after Queen Elizabeth took the throne and decades before the word gay would mean anything safe. Homosexuality was still a crime in Britain, punishable by prison, public shaming, and career collapse. And yet, there he was, Gielgud, vulnerable, brilliant, and suddenly very, very human. He was mortified. He tried to cancel a performance the next day. His friends told him not to, and so he walked onto that stage, shoulders heavy, hands shaking, and received a standing ovation before he'd said a single word. The audience knew, and, impossibly, they stood with him. It wasn't forgiveness, it was allegiance. Gielgud never publicly discussed his sexuality in the way we might expect today, but he lived it, quietly, constantly, in glances, in rumors, in the theater, where men could kiss on stage as long as it was under the guise of tragedy. And here's the irony. His arrest didn't ruin him. It made him mythic. The man who played Hamlet, Lear, and Prospero was now caught in his own Greek tragedy, exposed by the very society that applauded him nightly. His colleagues didn't abandon him. Many, in fact, rallied. The scandal simmered, then faded, and Sir John went on to win an Oscar, countless BAFTAs, and, eventually, deep, if guarded, respect. It's almost poetic. A man who made a living pretending to be kings and fools was caught simply being himself. And still he endured. Gracefully, elegantly, as if the theater itself refused to punish him for the world's hypocrisies. But if Gielgud's story feels like a Shakespearean drama with a second-act redemption, the next name on our list reads more like a post-war ghost story, because some actors never came out. Some never even admitted it to themselves, and some, like him, built entire lives behind velvet curtains and never stepped out until it was too late. If you're still with us, curious, unsettled, maybe even rethinking the faces you thought you knew, go ahead and subscribe. There's more where this came from. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Late night in London? Sunrise in Sydney? We're listening wherever you are. 3. Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde was the kind of leading man who didn't just smolder. He shimmered. With cheekbones that could cut glass and eyes that seemed permanently on the verge of revealing something forbidden, he was Britain's reluctant matinee idol. Reluctant, because the part he played off-screen was far trickier than anything written in the script. For the public, Bogarde was the charming bachelor with a perfect smile. For those who looked closer, there was a shadow just behind the lens. He never officially came out, never gave the big tell-all interview, never marched. But he lived with his manager and close companion, Anthony Forwood, for nearly 40 years. They shared homes, travels, dogs, and, by many accounts, a quiet, constant love. The kind that didn't need to be named, because naming it might have destroyed it. For decades, fans and reporters danced around the nature of the relationship. They were just friends, roommates, colleagues. The usual euphemisms, but biographers have since peeled back the layers. Letters, photographs, diaries, evidence not of scandal, but of deep domestic tenderness. If it wasn't love, it was something hauntingly close. Bogarde's acting choices later in life seemed to reflect a man increasingly unafraid to peer into the mirror. In The Servant, Victim, and Death in Venice, he played characters tangled in repression, desire, and decay. Especially Victim, a 1961 film that openly tackled the criminalization of homosexuality in Britain, with Bogarde portraying a man blackmailed over his relationships with other men. It was a role that risked his reputation, and he took it anyway. Some called him brave, others called him reckless. But perhaps he was just tired of pretending. Even if he never said it outright, Bogarde left breadcrumbs. And when the credits rolled, those who knew how to read between the lines found something startlingly honest. But not all love stories end with ambiguity and art house films. Some come wrapped in tuxedos, Oscars, and royal honors. And our next actor? He had all of that, and maybe, just maybe, a secret too big for even his thunderous voice to contain. 4. Sir Laurence Olivier. Sir Laurence Olivier wasn't just a star, he was the star. The blueprint, the voice of thunder and silk, the man who made Shakespeare box office. Knighted, married to Vivien Leigh, worshipped by critics, and feared by co-stars. But the thing about playing kings your whole life is that eventually, people forget you're still flesh and blood underneath the crown. Rumors followed Olivier like stage fog. Persistent, inevitable, unconfirmed. They whispered of Danny Kaye, the American comedian with whom Olivier allegedly shared more than just hotel bills. They whispered of passionate friendships, of emotional dependencies that felt unusual. Biographers took sides. Some wrote it off as theater gossip. Others argued it was a quiet truth wrapped in decades of denial. Olivier himself once claimed that all actors are bisexual, by nature of their craft. It was a flippant remark, tossed off in a book, but it lingered. Because in some ways, it was easier to speak in riddles than it was to speak plainly, especially when your reputation had been built brick by brick on the illusion of classical masculinity. Still, traces remain. In private letters, in strained marriages, in performances that seem to vibrate with an intensity just shy of personal revelation. In The Entertainer, he plays a broken-down music hall performer clinging to faded fame. It's a role many critics saw as startlingly close to the man behind the legend. Publicly, he was Olivier the Titan. But privately? Maybe there were pieces of him no stage could ever contain. And that's the thing with myths. You can adore them, quote them, study them, but you'll never truly know what they were protecting, unless, of course, you're forced to. Like our next actor, charming, knighted, and once caught red-handed in a quiet act of rebellion against a country that never quite forgave the people it feared. 5. Alec Guinness. Alec Guinness was a man of masks. Whether he was wielding a lightsaber in a desert or slipping into the skin of 8 characters in a single film, he specialized in becoming someone else. And perhaps that's why his real life was so carefully edited, more stagecraft than confession. To the world, he was the quintessential British actor, private, dignified, elusive. But behind the curtain, something else flickered, something half-hidden and never fully claimed. In 1946, long before Obi-Wan Kenobi and royal titles, Guinness was arrested for what the tabloids delicately termed an incident in a public toilet. The name on the charge sheet wasn't his own. He used a pseudonym. The press never got hold of it, and the case somehow vanished beneath the surface of his rising fame. But the whispers remained. Not screams, not scandals, just whispers. A persistent hum behind the applause. His biographers have hinted at bisexual tendencies. There were alleged affairs, emotional bonds with men described as unusually intense. But Guinness, devoutly Catholic and fiercely private, never acknowledged any of it. Not publicly, not even obliquely. For him, the silence wasn't shame, it was strategy. Perhaps even survival. In an industry where perception is currency, ambiguity was safer than honesty. And yet, there's something achingly personal in the roles he chose. Characters torn between identities, men living secret lives, misfits navigating worlds that don't understand them. It's tempting to read into it, and many have. But with Guinness, the truth is like fog on a moor, always just out of reach. He lived a long life, acclaimed, celebrated, knighted, but never quite unveiled. He died with the same enigma he lived by. No declarations, no revisions, just one last bow in darkness. But where Guinness slipped through history like a shadow, the next name on our list carved his way through it with unapologetic flair. He fought tigers on screen, swashbuckled across continents, and may have had just as much drama off-screen, with whispers that followed him from set to set and into the private clubs of the British film elite. 6. Stuart Granger. Stuart Granger wasn't just a movie star. He was a cinematic archetype. A jawline sculpted by the gods, a voice like aged scotch, and a swagger that made swords look ornamental. In the golden age of British film, he was the man every man wanted to be, and every woman was expected to adore. But that's the thing about archetypes. They're often built to distract from what's underneath. Granger played heroes, lovers, adventurers. Yet behind that confident stride was a man surrounded by rumors he never quite outran. He denied them, of course, publicly, forcefully. But the speculation persisted. Relationships with men in the industry, private parties that blurred the lines, a personal life that didn't align with the studio-manufactured fantasy. Biographers have pointed to certain patterns. Alleged affairs that never made the gossip columns. Close male friendships that seemed to stretch beyond the standard script. He was married to actress Jean Simmons, yes, but Hollywood marriages have never been reliable maps to private truths. Still, Granger's performance never cracked. He leaned into his image with gusto, dueling on screen, romancing ingenues, giving interviews filled with charm and deflection. He was a master of redirection. And maybe that's what acting really is, knowing exactly what to show and exactly what to withhold. But the industry had a funny way of rewarding the mask and punishing the man. As his star faded, so did the illusion. He moved to Spain, then the U.S. He wrote a memoir late in life, tellingly selective, and left much unsaid. The rumors never exploded into scandal. They just lingered, unresolved, like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. And maybe that was the safest way to survive it all. But the next man didn't survive by avoiding the truth. He turned it into art. He sang it, wrote it, laughed through it, and behind the cigarette holder and razor-sharp wit, he lived a life of private longing and public brilliance, entirely on his own terms. 7. Noel Coward. Noel Coward was born wearing a tuxedo, or at least that's how it felt. He entered the world of British theater like a martini, dry, sharp, and unapologetically sophisticated. A playwright, composer, singer, and actor, Coward didn't just create characters, he became an institution. Dandyish, debonair, devastatingly clever. He was the man who taught Britain how to flirt, how to gossip, and how to smoke a cigarette with conviction. But beneath all that sparkle lived a truth he never said out loud, because he didn't have to. Coward never officially came out, but he also never exactly hid. He lived as he pleased, traveling with his male companions, hosting lavish parties filled with theater's most glittering misfits, and writing plays that winked at everything British society was pretending not to see. He once described his personal life as private, peculiar, and nobody's business. And that, in its own way, was a kind of defiance. In an age when queerness was still criminalized, Coward simply was, camp, coded, and unconcerned. He became a master of subtext. His scripts danced with double meanings. His characters flirted across genders and expectations. It was all right there, between the lines, for anyone clever enough or queer enough to catch it. He wrote not for approval, but for recognition. And for the ones who needed it, Coward's plays were more than entertainment. They were sanctuary. Still, even as he waltzed through the world with wit as his armor, he knew the stakes. He kept his relationships discreet, his answers vague, and his dignity polished to a shine. Fame protected him, but only just. He was knighted eventually, of course, but only after years of being politely ignored by the establishment he outclassed. In the end, Coward wasn't just a figure of theatrical brilliance. He was a pioneer in coded survival. Proof that sometimes resistance doesn't have to be loud. It can come with perfect posture, a razor-sharp comeback, and a well-timed piano chord. But not every actor had Coward's elegance or invulnerability. Some bore their truth more quietly, buried under powdered wigs and period costumes, shielding feelings that would never be publicly named, like the man whose wide smile hid a life of whispered companionship and carefully curated ambiguity. 8. Robert Morley. Robert Morley never looked like a leading man, and frankly, he didn't want to. He specialized in playing pompous aristocrats, chatty eccentrics, and men who always seemed slightly too large for the drawing room they occupied. With his rotund figure and booming voice, he was the opposite of Hollywood's chiseled ideals, and that made him indispensable to British cinema. He didn't have to seduce, he just had to show up and deliver a monologue with delicious self-satisfaction. But even character actors have their mysteries. Unlike his more visibly queer peers, Morley lived a life of extreme discretion. He married, had children, built a career as the lovable windbag of British theatre and film. And yet, the rumors persisted. They weren't cruel, just curious. Whispers of close friendships with men that lasted decades. Glimpses of emotional intimacy that felt just a bit too intense for mere camaraderie. It was the kind of speculation that clings when someone is too private, too polished, too unwilling to elaborate. And Morley never elaborated. He was old school in the purest sense, guarded, witty, and allergic to self-disclosure. His autobiography is charming but evasive. You come away knowing what he thought of restaurants and theater critics, but not what he felt about love. Not really. For a man who played so many verbose characters, his own silence speaks volumes. It's possible he wasn't hiding anything at all. Or it's possible he was hiding everything in plain sight. That was, after all, the British way. Keep calm. Carry on. And if anyone asks too many questions, distract them with an anecdote about Winston Churchill. Morley's world was one of velvet curtains and unspoken rules. But the next actor didn't just bend the rules, he broke them. And in doing so, he gave the world a glimpse into the kind of double life most could only guess at. His performances were legendary. His diaries, even more so. And when the truth came out, it wasn't scandal, it was liberation. 9. Michael Redgrave. Michael Redgrave had the kind of voice that made silence feel like an interruption. On stage and screen, he radiated authority, commanding, tragic, noble. One of Britain's greatest classical actors, he could summon Hamlet's madness, Uncle Vanya's despair, and the weary dignity of an aging professor with the turn of a phrase. But behind all that gravitas was a life humming with contradictions. Redgrave was married, famously so, to actress Rachel Kempson. Together they built an acting dynasty. Vanessa, Corin, and Lynn, all stage royalty. But while the public saw a perfect portrait of English theatrical success, the private version was more layered. Redgrave was bisexual, and by his own account, deeply divided about it. His diaries, published after his death, revealed a man in constant conflict with himself, both drawn to and tormented by his relationships with men. He referred to his orientation in euphemism, frustration, and occasional bursts of honesty. He didn't live in total secrecy, but neither did he live in peace with his identity. There was fear, of scandal, of exposure, of hurting the family he loved. And yet, there were also affairs, encounters, emotional entanglements, enough to paint a portrait of a man whose personal life was far more complex than any role he ever played. What's remarkable is how much of this Redgrave poured into his performances. His characters often carried a kind of invisible ache. There's a vulnerability in his work that now reads like autobiography in disguise. And once you know the truth, it's hard to unsee it. In his later years, as his health declined and the world slowly shifted, Redgrave began to reflect more openly. There was no dramatic reveal, no public statement. But the mask slipped just enough. Enough for historians to piece together the quiet struggle behind the thundering applause. But while Redgrave agonized in private, our next figure made no such apologies. He was open, loud, unrepentant, and his name remains forever tied to the British New Wave, a director who stepped in front of the camera just long enough to show the world that bisexuality could be just as bold as art itself. 10. Tony Richardson. Tony Richardson never cared much for boxes. Not in film, and certainly not in life. As a director, he tore apart the conventions of British cinema, ushering in the kitchen sink dramas of the 1960s with a camera that wasn't afraid of mess. As a man, he moved between relationships with women and men with equal chaotic intensity. And while his fame came mostly from behind the lens, Richardson's personal life was often louder than his movies. He was openly bisexual in a time when that openness was still considered a career risk, especially for someone rubbing shoulders with the establishment. He married actress Vanessa Redgrave, had 2 daughters, and by all accounts loved his family. But he also had affairs with men. Public ones, private ones, ones that became part of the industry's whisper network, and ones that made it into the footnotes of biographies. Richardson's sexual openness wasn't just a fact, it was a defiance. He refused to choose a single narrative. His art mirrored that restlessness, gritty, bold, sometimes confrontational. Films like A Taste of Honey and The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner gave voice to outsiders, working-class characters, queer characters, people pushed to society's edge. It wasn't activism per se, but it was empathy, a cinematic empathy born from knowing what it meant to live between lines. He didn't often speak publicly about his orientation. It wasn't the era for that, but neither did he deny it. And as the AIDS crisis loomed in the 1980s, Richardson's place in the conversation grew more complicated, more tragic, and more urgent. He passed away in 1991, a casualty of a time that silenced too many voices, even the bold ones. Richardson didn't just direct stories, he embodied one. His life was a challenge to the neatness of categories, and his work remains an elegy for all the untidy lives lived in the margins. But the man who follows him didn't live in the margins. He reigned in the spotlight. And yet, even in the full glow of public adoration, he kept a private truth tucked neatly behind his spectacles and royal honors, hidden in plain sight. 11. Nigel Hawthorne. Nigel Hawthorne was the kind of actor who could make repression look regal. Best known for playing brittle bureaucrats and icy intellectuals, he had a talent for making silence feel like a speech. His most iconic role, Sir Humphrey Appleby in Yes, Minister, was a masterclass in polished avoidance. So perhaps it was fitting that, off-screen, he lived a life shaped by the same quiet calculations. For most of his career, Hawthorne kept his sexuality out of the spotlight, not because he was ashamed, but because the spotlight itself was hostile. Born in 1929, he came of age when being openly gay in Britain could end a career or worse. So he built his life carefully, choosing privacy over provocation, discretion over confession. But not denial. Those who knew him knew. His long-term partner, Trevor Bentham, was by his side for over 2 decades. At home, at events, in the wings. They didn't need to explain. The truth was there, unspoken but undeniable. Everything changed in 1995 when Hawthorne was nominated for an Academy Award for The Madness of King George. The press, sniffing for a story, outed him. It wasn't his plan. He would have preferred to do it on his own terms, when he felt it mattered. But the headlines did what the stage never could. They turned his private life into public conversation. To his credit, Hawthorne didn't retreat. He addressed the attention with the same dry wit he brought to his characters, acknowledging it, clarifying it, but never letting it define him. It's a fact, he said, but it's not a subject. And perhaps that's the most British way of coming out ever recorded. He didn't become an activist. He didn't reinvent his career. He just continued, unbothered, as if the world had finally caught up to something he'd long since accepted. For audiences, it was a quiet revelation. For Hawthorne, it was just Tuesday. But if his story was about navigating visibility with grace, the next actor lived in a far more dangerous kind of spotlight, one that offered no grace at all. He was beloved by millions, and yet, when the curtain fell, he was completely alone in his truth. Until one fateful night, when the lie could no longer hold. 12. Wilfrid Bramble. Wilfrid Bramble wasn't supposed to be a cultural icon. He was supposed to be a background figure, an aging character actor with a tired face and a forgettable voice. But then came Steptoe and Son, and suddenly Bramble became a household name, immortalized as the irritable, unwashed, dirty old man of British comedy. The irony? In real life, he was nothing like the part. Meticulous, private, intensely reserved, but trapped in a caricature that would follow him to the grave. Bramble was born in 1912, in a world that had no patience for difference and no language for queerness. He never came out publicly. He didn't campaign or give interviews or write memoirs. But then came the incident, an arrest in 1962 for importuning, a charge that has long served as code for same-sex solicitation. It was hushed, quietly processed, never spoken of by him again. But the press took note. The whisper campaign began, and yet his career didn't collapse. Steptoe continued. Audiences still tuned in, none the wiser, or perhaps too British to care publicly. But behind the scenes, the cost was clear. Colleagues described Bramble as distant, melancholy, difficult to know, not angry, just closed. And it's not hard to see why. Living in fear of exposure, labeled by an incident, unable to live openly, even as millions laughed at his performances. There's something quietly tragic about his story. A man who made the nation laugh while carrying a secret that was never quite a secret. Who played a grotesque parody of age and masculinity while hiding a truth that no script could accommodate. And who, like so many of his generation, found safety not in confession, but in camouflage. He never addressed the rumors, never corrected the record. He just disappeared into the role and then into history. But history doesn't forget so easily, and neither did the actor who comes next, one who wore the role of Sherlock Holmes like a second skin, while hiding a private life that was far more mysterious than anything Conan Doyle ever wrote. 13. Jeremy Brett. Jeremy Brett didn't play Sherlock Holmes. He became him. Obsessed with detail, consumed by precision, he gave the world's most iconic detective a new layer of depth, manic energy, visible torment, and a genius that never sat comfortably inside his skin. But even as Brett delivered what many consider the definitive Holmes performance, another mystery was playing out behind the camera, one he never solved publicly. He was magnetic, elegant, intense, and he never quite fit the mold. Brett married once, briefly, and had a son. But much of his life was spent in the company of men, often described in interviews and memoirs with the kind of vague reverence that signals something deeper. Biographers have hinted at it. Friends have nodded toward it. The clues are there, unmistakable, if you know how to look. But like Holmes himself, Brett remained cryptic. Emotional truth lived in glances, not declarations. There's a persistent thread in his life, a yearning for connection coupled with a need to vanish. His relationships, both romantic and platonic, seemed to burn brightly and then dissolve into absence. He struggled with mental health for years, bipolar disorder that he spoke about with rare honesty later in life. But the other battles, the more private ones, went unnamed. He once said of playing Holmes, "I lose myself. The danger is, I become him." It's hard not to see that as more than just acting. Brett was a man who gave everything to performance because the stage was the one place he could almost be himself, so long as it was someone else. In the end, he left behind a trail of masterful performances and unanswered questions. His Holmes could see through every disguise but never took off his own. He didn't need to come out to be visible. He was already speaking in a language only the observant could understand. But if Brett was the haunted genius, the next man on our list was the polished enigma. Hollywood heartthrob by design, British by birth, and part of one of cinema's most persistent rumors, played out in Technicolor and champagne flutes behind closed doors. 14. Anthony Perkins, technically American, spiritually British. Anthony Perkins lived in the kind of cultural in-between that made his secrets both easier and harder to keep. Though born in New York, his long residence and work in the UK, not to mention his air of refined unease, earned him a place in the hushed whispers of the British acting world. He was elegance mixed with electricity, the boy next door with something brittle behind the smile. And though he's most famous for Psycho, his real life held shadows Hitchcock could never quite script. Perkins was bisexual, a fact confirmed posthumously and supported by several contemporaries and biographers. He had relationships with men, including several well-known figures within the industry. Tab Hunter, Sondheim, and others, mentioned only in passing, coded in memoirs and disguised as close friendships. He eventually married and had children, but his romantic history tells a broader story, one of constraint, caution, and carefully measured steps. In interviews, he was often twitchy, guarded, evasive. He spoke in metaphors, smiled too hard, gave answers that sounded like riddles. It wasn't dishonesty, it was protection. For Perkins, the performance didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. It never ended. And yet, in that restraint, there was also rebellion. He didn't apologize for who he was. He simply didn't advertise it, which, for the era, was both survival and statement. He worked in the UK often, drawn to the more nuanced roles that British cinema allowed. Characters who were fractured, haunted, morally slippery. They mirrored the parts of himself he couldn't say out loud. Watching his films is like watching a coded language of expression. Every flinch, every pause, a possible confession. Perkins never became a gay icon in the traditional sense. He wasn't loud, he wasn't political. But he was visible in the most ironic of ways. The man who played Norman Bates, trapped in a split identity, was quietly living one of his own. And while Perkins remained tantalizingly just out of reach, the next name didn't have that luxury. He was British-born, globally adored, and relentlessly speculated about, proof that even Hollywood royalty couldn't outrun the rumors forever. 15. Cary Grant. Cary Grant was born Archibald Leach in Bristol, but the man the world came to know bore little resemblance to the shy boy who grew up in poverty and parental disappearance. He reinvented himself, twice. Once as a suave leading man in Hollywood, and again as a mystery that no one ever quite managed to solve. To this day, Cary Grant is a name that evokes charm, style, and sophistication. But beneath the designer suits and champagne-soaked performances, lived a life layered in suggestion, contradiction, and carefully rehearsed denial. He was married 5 times. Each union was dutifully covered in magazines, but few lasted long. The tabloids, ever hungry, couldn't ignore what they called the bachelor years, 2 decades of living with fellow actor Randolph Scott in a shared beach house. Their relationship was close, intimate, captured in photos that suggested something far beyond friendship. The studio PR teams called it Hollywood's most eligible bachelors. The public read between the lines. The rumors were relentless. Grant dismissed them with a mix of mockery and irritation. In one interview, he snapped, "All that talk about me being gay is a bunch of lies." But then, of course, it would have to be. He came from a system built on myth-making, where even the smallest crack in the facade could end a career. He played it safe, or smart, or maybe just exhausted. What makes Grant's story so enduring isn't confirmation. It's the refusal to simplify him. The tension between the man and the image, between what he said and what he wasn't allowed to say. In the end, he became the embodiment of a particular kind of queerness, unconfirmed, unclaimed, and yet unmistakably present. Whether he and Randolph Scott were lovers or not, they lived a version of domestic intimacy rarely seen between men on screen or off. Grant once said, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant." But what if Cary Grant wasn't real? What if he was just the best role Archibald Leach ever played? And while Grant was sculpting myths under the California sun, another British-born artist was across the ocean, redefining horror and heartbreak on his own terms. Not an actor first, but a director with an actor's soul. And a man who refused to hide in the shadows he so artfully created. 16. James Whale. James Whale understood horror because he lived it. The trenches of World War I, the unrelenting climb of the British class system, the suffocating gaze of a society obsessed with appearances. And yet, somehow, he turned all of that into beauty, twisted, tragic, and unforgettable. Whale was best known for directing Frankenstein, 1931, and The Invisible Man, 1933. But before Hollywood and horror, he was just another working-class lad from Dudley, obsessed with painting and performance. What made Whale remarkable wasn't just that he was openly gay in 1930s Hollywood, it's that he didn't seem to care who knew. He lived with producer David Lewis for over 2 decades in what was, by all accounts, a loving, stable relationship. There were no beard marriages, no elaborate PR fabrications. He existed with a level of quiet honesty that feels almost supernatural for his time. But his queerness wasn't just personal. It was cinematic. Frankenstein's monster is a misunderstood outsider. The Invisible Man is undone by his own freedom. Whale's films are filled with characters trying to navigate a world that finds them monstrous. They are not villains. They are misfits, seekers, exiles, just like their creator. Whale's style was extravagant and subversive. His films smuggled in queerness with a wink and a flourish, camp before we had a word for it. He gave us gothic grandeur wrapped in social critique and never once flinched from a narrative that mirrored his own sense of otherness. He eventually stepped back from the industry, not because he ran out of ideas, but because the studio system ran out of room for people like him. Too bold, too smart, too open. James Whale didn't live long enough to be reclaimed as an icon, but he left the blueprint behind. A reminder that horror can be truth in disguise, and monsters are often just misunderstood men with too much feeling and nowhere safe to put it. And speaking of feeling, our next actor embodied sensual contradiction like few others. A national treasure, a brooding heartthrob, and a man whose love life was as fluid as his artistry. 17. Alan Bates. Alan Bates always looked like a man with a secret. That brooding intensity, the half smile, the eyes that could go from gentle to devastating in a single scene. He built his career playing complex, emotionally volatile men who loved too much and said too little. And perhaps that wasn't just acting. Born in Derbyshire in 1934, Bates rose through the post-war wave of British actors who brought realism, sensuality, and grit to the screen. But beneath the surface of critical acclaim and romantic leads, his life remained carefully partitioned. He married actress Victoria Ward and had twin sons. On paper, it was the script of respectability. But the truth, as often happens, was more layered. Bates was bisexual, and those who knew him well say his relationships with men were just as real, just as formative as anything the public ever saw. The tragedy wasn't in the duality, it was in the silence that surrounded it. Like many actors of his generation, he walked the narrow bridge between personal truth and public expectation, where one misstep could collapse everything beneath him. Unlike some of his peers, Bates didn't leave behind a manifesto. No posthumous confession, no tell-all interviews. What he left was in the performances. Watch Women in Love, where he wrestles, shirtless and drenched in metaphor, with Oliver Reed in a scene critics have parsed for decades. Watch The Go-Between, where the tension isn't just about class, but about everything unspoken. In role after role, Bates explored desire, repression, and longing, never loudly, but always with unnerving precision. He lived privately, even after his wife's death. There were partners. There were whispers. But the dignity with which he handled both fame and secrecy remained striking. He didn't need to be a symbol. He just needed to be. And with that, the curtain falls on this collection of actors whose lives were stitched together by artistry, ambiguity, and a defiance too quiet to be called rebellion, but too steady to be ignored. Yet in a way, these were never just stories about sexuality. They were stories about the cost of masks, the courage of restraint, and the strange unspoken power of simply surviving in plain sight.